Chapter 1 will give us an orientation to the human body. In this lecture segment, we will define two fields of study, that is anatomy and physiology, and we're going to describe how these two fields of study help us to understand the body as a whole. So let's go ahead and start with anatomy. Anatomy is the study of structure and form. And when we study anatomy, we ask the question of how the body's parts are arranged and connected to one another. So by studying anatomy, we can ask how the blood vessels, the muscles, and the bones of the human body are arranged and connected with respect to one another. So anatomy can be divided into gross or macroscopic anatomy and microscopic anatomy. So gross anatomy is the study of large body structures that are visible to the unaided eye. And here we're going to define two disciplines of gross anatomy. We have systemic gross anatomy, which studies the body by organ system. So later on in this chapter, we will look at the 11 organ systems of the body and their functions. And systemic gross anatomy is studying each of those 11 organ systems individually. Surface gross anatomy uses surface features on the skin to locate and identify structures that are deep underneath the body's surface. So these are two disciplines within the field of gross or macroscopic anatomy. So microscopic anatomy deals with structures that are too small to be studied with the unaided eye. So one of those disciplines is known as histology, and histology is the study of tissues. Cytology is the study of cells, and so of course we need microscopic tools and instruments in order to be able to look at what's going on at the cellular and tissue levels. So that's anatomy. So we'll shift our focus here to physiology. So physiology focuses more on the events that are occurring at the molecular and cellular level. And these events are telling us how the body's parts are working to support survival. So really physiology is investigating the biological processes that are happening within cells and at the molecular level that are supporting survival. So physiology is a discipline that draws upon the principles of really the three main natural sciences, which are biology, chemistry, and physics. And so to give you a good example of this, the principles that determine how fluids flow through pipes, that is the physical principles that determine how a fluid flows through a pipe, really helps us to understand how blood, which is a biological fluid, flows through blood vessels, which are simply biological pipes. So physics, chemistry, and biology kind of all come together to tell us how things like blood flow work. Another example is how electrical and chemical signals that are within skeletal muscles cause skeletal muscle contraction and movement of the skeleton as a whole. So a physiology question that we can ask is how do muscles move the skeletal system? So we can look at what's happening within the muscle cells at the physiological level to determine how that's happening. Another physiological question that we can ask is how do neurons communicate? And so physiology helps us understand that the nervous system, also kind of like skeletal muscle cells, uses electrical and chemical signals so that one neuron, that is one signaling cell of the nervous system, can communicate with another neuron here. So that is physiology and the types of questions that we can ask when we look at the human body through the lens of physiology. Although we often study anatomy and physiology separately because that makes it a lot easier for us, these two disciplines are really inseparable because function always reflects structure. And so we have this principle known as the principle of complementarity, which pretty simply states that function follows form. So if you're not quite sure how to apply this, let's take a look at a few examples here. So the principle of complementarity, for example, here with the skeletal system, states that hard bones, which is a form, right? We have hardened minerals and calcium within our skeleton that makes bones hard and tough, aids in protecting deeper internal organs. So we have form, the hardness of our skeleton and bones, which serves the function of protecting the deeper internal organs. So that's the principle of complementarity at work within the skeletal system. Another example here with the skin or the integumentary system is that oils in our skin help to reduce water loss across the surface of the skin. So because our skin contains oils and oil glands in it, that's part of our anatomy, those aid in the function of reducing water loss. So with the principle of complementarity here, we see a connection between form and function. Okay. Slight detour here to the field of embryology. Embryology, or also developmental biology, so embryology is also called developmental biology. It follows the structural and functional changes, that is the anatomy and physiology, that's occurring during development before we are born. Embryology can be both studied at the gross or macroscopic level, or it can be studied at the microscopic level. And we can ask questions about the anatomy at the gross or microscopic level, or we can ask physiology questions, which mostly deals with things occurring at the microscopic level. In this course, however, our main focus will be on adult humans. We will occasionally make a few detours to talk about some developmental aspects, so we'll make a few detours to talk about developmental biology, but for the most part, we will focus on adult human anatomy and physiology. One last term here that I will leave you with is a term called pathology, and pathology is the study of how disease affects the body. So we can look at pathology, again, kind of through the lenses of both anatomy and physiology. That is, how do we get anatomical changes with disease, and how do we get physiological, or what physiological changes are occurring with certain diseases. Just like with our other fields here, we can look at pathology through the lens of gross or macroscopic level or microscopic pathology. That is how disease affects tissues and cells, whereas gross pathology would be looking at how disease affects whole organs and whole organ systems. So to give you an example of this, before we conclude this section, is that a heart attack or a myocardial infarction has a very characteristic pathology within the heart. So with heart attacks, what happens is that the blood vessels that serve the cardiac muscle tissue often can become blocked, and when they become blocked, that cuts off the blood supply to the heart muscle tissue, and this heart muscle tissue begins to die. And so with heart attacks or myocardial infarctions, we have a very characteristic pathology where we see dead muscle tissue within the heart itself.